Courtroom 4B was suffocatingly quiet. Richard smirked, confident his overweight, supposedly simple-minded wife would walk away with pennies. He thought he had buried his secrets, his offshore accounts, and his mistress perfectly. He was dead wrong. Today, the woman he spent years belittling was about to strip him of everything. The heavy oak doors of the Cook County Courthouse swung shut, sealing Richard Higgins and his soon-to-be ex-wife, Clara, inside the sterile, wood-paneled arena of Judge Harrison Caldwell. Outside those doors, Richard's 26-year-old mistress, Chloe Montgomery, was waiting in the corridor. She had spent the morning complaining about the courthouse coffee and reapplying her expensive lip gloss, eager for the moment Richard would emerge legally unburdened and millions of dollars richer. Richard adjusted the French cuffs of his bespoke $4,000 Brioni suit. At 42, he was the picture of corporate vitality, lean tanned from weekend golf retreats in Scottsdale, and vibrating with the arrogant energy of a man who believed the world owed him its absolute obedience. He was the CEO and founder of Ether Logistics, a supply chain software company that had recently reached a staggering valuation of $80 million. Across the wide center aisle sat Clara. She wore a simple, off-the-rack navy blue dress and a grey knit cardigan. At 41, Clara carried the physical evidence of a brutally difficult decade. A severe thyroid condition, severely exacerbated by the chronic stress of managing Richard's volatile temper and narcissistic demands, had caused her to gain significant weight over the last 7 years. Richard had not let her forget a single pound of it. His cruelty had started subtly passive-aggressive jokes at dinner parties about her letting herself go, and had evolved into blatant, vicious insults behind closed doors. He had convinced her, and entirely convinced himself, that she was a useless, lazy liability, who was lucky he even allowed her to reside in his sprawling suburban Chicago mansion. Richard leaned over to his attorney, Diane Croft. Diane was a notoriously cutthroat divorce lawyer, known throughout the state for leaving opposing spouses entirely destitute. "Look at her," Richard whispered, a cruel, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "She didn't even try to dress up. Her lawyer, Pendleton, looks like he bought his suit at a discount rack in the 90s. Let's just crush them and get this over with. We have celebratory reservations at Nobu at 8, and Chloe hates waiting." Diane nodded sharply, her eyes cold and focused on her legal pads. "We stick exactly to the narrative, Richard. She's an estranged dependent. She contributed nothing to the marriage financially or professionally. We offer the $5,000 a month in alimony for 3 years, a lump sum of $200,000, and she walks away from Ether Logistics completely. If she fights, we drag it out until her legal fees bankrupt her." On the other side of the room, Clara stared straight ahead. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, completely still. Next to her sat Arthur Pendleton, a 60-year-old attorney with rumpled grey hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Arthur didn't have the flashy billboards or the designer crocodile briefcase that Diane Croft flaunted, but he possessed something much more dangerous, an encyclopedic knowledge of forensic accounting, and a deep, burning disdain for arrogant men who underestimated quiet women. Judge Caldwell, a no-nonsense jurist with a permanent scowl, banged his wooden gavel heavily. "Court is in session. We are here for the dissolution of marriage and distribution of assets in the matter of Higgins versus Higgins. Counsel, are we proceeding with opening statements?" Diane Croft stood up, immediately smoothing her perfectly tailored skirt. "Yes, Your Honor." Diane's opening statement was a masterclass in character assassination, masquerading as legal argument. She systematically painted Richard as a solitary genius, a man who built an empire from his garage through sheer willpower, 90-hour work weeks, and unparalleled business acumen. Clara, conversely, was depicted as a reluctant, ungrateful passenger on Richard's rocket ship to success. Your Honor. Diane projected her voice, ensuring every harsh syllable echoed off the high ceilings. For the last 10 years of this 12-year marriage, Mrs. Higgins has not held a job. She has not contributed a single line of code, a single client, or a single dollar to Ether Logistics. Her days consisted of daytime television and spending my client's hard-earned money. My client generously acknowledges his responsibility to provide a reasonable transition fund, but Mrs. Higgins is now demanding half of a company she could not even begin to understand. To grant her 50% of Mr. Higgins's life's work would be a severe, irreversible miscarriage of justice. Richard sat back, crossing his legs, looking supremely satisfied. He shot a brief, mocking glance at Clara. "Take the 200 grand, you cow," he thought, masking his disdain with a carefully practiced look of polite resignation. When it was Arthur Pendleton's turn, the older lawyer stood up slowly. He adjusted his glasses and looked up at the judge, then over at Richard. "Your Honor." Arthur began, his voice surprisingly soft, but possessing a resonant, gravelly authority. "Appearances can be profoundly deceiving. Mr. Higgins believes that because his wife does not wear expensive designer suits, because she prefers the quiet of her home to the flash of corporate galas, and yes, because her physical appearance has changed over the years, that she is somehow ignorant. He has fatally confused her silence for stupidity. Over the next few hours we intend to prove that Clara Higgins is not only entitled to half of the marital estate, she is the very foundation upon which it was built. We will also demonstrate that Mr. Higgins has engaged in a systematic, fraudulent dissipation of marital assets to fund a clandestine and highly expensive double life." Richard scoffed, the sound loud enough for the court reporter to look up. Judge Caldwell narrowed his eyes sharply. "Control your client, Ms. Croft. Nothing but desperate fiction, Your Honor." Diane countered smoothly, though she shot Richard a harsh, warning look. Richard wasn't worried. He had been meticulous. His accountant had routed all of his personal, fun money through a complex, impenetrable web of limited liability companies. The luxury penthouse he bought for Chloe, the first-class trips to Paris, the $100,000 Cartier jewelry, it was all buried so deep in shell companies that a rumpled dinosaur like Arthur Pendleton would need a decade to untangle it. Or so Richard thought. He didn't realize that the woman sitting across the room, the woman he had called useless and fat for years, possessed an IQ of 145 and had spent the last 8 months quietly downloading, decrypting, and analyzing every single financial record hard drive and offshore ledger in his locked home office. The trial moved swiftly into witness testimony. Diane Croft called Richard to the stand, first eager to establish his undeniable ownership and sole creation of the disputed wealth. "Mr. Higgins." Diane paced confidently before the witness stand. "Can you describe the precise origins of Ether Logistics?" Richard smiled warmly, leaning into the microphone to project his carefully curated charm. "I came up with the core algorithm in 2014. I worked out of our tiny, cramped apartment, coding, until my fingers bled. I pitched to over 50 investors before one finally gave me a shot. I built the infrastructure, I hired the executive team, and I drove the international sales. And what was your wife Clara doing during this critical incubation period?" Richard sighed, looking at Clara with a perfectly manufactured expression of pity. Clara struggled. She stayed home. I tried constantly to encourage her to find a passion, maybe take up a hobby, or get a part-time job to keep her active, but she preferred to stay on the couch. I loved her so. I supported her entirely. But as the company grew, she just checked out. She refused to attend company dinners. She let her health deteriorate entirely. We grew apart because I was building a future, and she was unfortunately stuck in the past. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Clara's expression remained entirely neutral, though her hands gripped each other a fraction tighter. Did Mrs. Higgins ever contribute to the financial strategies, the coding, or the business development of ether logistics? Diane asked, driving the final definitive nail. Never, Richard stated firmly, shaking his head. She wouldn't know a supply chain algorithm from a recipe for meatloaf. Thank you, Mr. Higgins. No further questions. Diane returned to her seat with a triumphant, razor-thin smile. Richard relaxed his shoulders, waiting for Arthur Pendleton to shuffle up and ask his predictably boring, ineffective questions. Arthur approached the podium. He didn't carry a massive stack of legal pads, just a single, unassuming manila folder. Good afternoon, Mr. Higgins, Arthur said mildly. Afternoon, Richard replied, oozing wealthy condescension. You painted a very vivid picture of your immense hard work. You stated you are the sole visionary and the sole financial engine of your marriage. Would you say you are meticulous with your finances? I am an exacting CEO, Mr. Pendleton. You don't build an $80 million company by losing track of your dimes. Excellent. Then you must be very familiar with an entity named Crescent Holdings, LLC. Richard's confident smile faltered for a microscopic second. It was barely noticeable, but Clara saw it, the slight twitch of his left eyelid. I am aware of it, Richard said, carefully adjusting his posture. It's a subsidiary venture, real estate investments, completely standard for a diversified corporate portfolio. Arthur opened his manila folder. Standard, you say? Let's look at this standard portfolio. I have here a deed of trust for a $1.2 million penthouse in the Gold Coast neighborhood, purchased entirely in cash by Crescent Holdings, LLC, exactly 14 months ago. Arthur handed a copy to the bailiff, who immediately passed it to the judge, and to a suddenly rigid Diane Croft. Diane frowned deeply, scanning the document. She had distinctly not been told about this specific property. Real estate is a solid investment, Richard said, his voice tightening defensively. It is a company asset. Is it? Arthur asked, adjusting his glasses on the bridge of his nose, because subpoenaed building security records and utility bills show that the sole exclusive resident of this company asset is a 26-year-old woman named Chloe Montgomery. Furthermore, the exorbitant HOA fees, the property taxes, and a rather extensive interior design bill from Restoration Hardware were all paid from a joint marital checking account that you secretly diverted funds into. Tell me, Mr. Higgins, did your company asset strictly require a custom pink velvet walk-in closet? Objection, Diane snapped, standing up quickly. Relevance Mr. Higgins's personal relationships post-separation are absolutely not the subject of this asset division. Your Honor, Arthur fired back smoothly, his tone hardening. We are establishing a blatant systematic dissipation of marital assets. Mr. Higgins used community funds, over $2 million in total, to secretly finance a lavish lifestyle for his paramour, while simultaneously attempting to starve his wife out of her legal, rightful half of the estate. Overruled, Judge Caldwell growled, staring down at Richard with sudden intense distaste. You may answer the question, Mr. Higgins. Why is your mistress living in a luxury property bought with hidden marital funds? Richard gripped the wooden edges of the witness stand. I earned that money. I built the damn company. If I want to invest in a property and allow a consultant to reside there, that is my prerogative. A consultant. Arthur raised a skeptical eyebrow. He pulled another sheet of paper from his folder. Let's talk about this so-called Consulting. I have here tax documents showing you paid Ms. Montgomery a salary of $250,000 a year as a brand strategist for Ether Logistics. Yet upon legally deposing your own head of marketing, we discovered Ms. Montgomery has never set foot in the corporate office, has produced 0 deliverables, and doesn't even possess a college degree. Mr. Higgins, isn't it true you committed blatant corporate embezzlement to pay your mistress? The courtroom erupted into shocked whispers. Diane Croft was furiously writing notes, her face flushed with unbridled anger at her own client for hiding this massive liability from her. "It's not embezzlement. It's my company," Richard shouted, his perfectly curated facade completely cracking under the immense pressure. He pointed a shaking, furious finger at Clara. "I made the money. She sat on her fat ass and did absolutely nothing for a decade. I deserve to spend what I built." Judge Caldwell slammed his gavel violently, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Mr. Higgins, one more outburst like that, and I will hold you in contempt of court and throw you in a holding cell. You will control your temper and answer the questions directly." Richard swallowed hard, his face turning a blotchy, unattractive red. "Yes, Your Honor." Arthur Pendleton didn't even blink. He let the heavy silence hang in the air, allowing Richard's venomous, misogynistic outburst to completely marinate in the judge's mind. "You keep loudly insisting it is your company, Mr. Higgins. Your money. Your sole genius." Arthur continued softly walking closer to the witness stand until he was just feet away. "You testified earlier under oath that Mrs. Higgins wouldn't know a supply chain algorithm from a meatloaf recipe." "That's right," Richard muttered, crossing his arms defensively over his chest. "Fascinating." Arthur turned back to his table. Clara, moving with quiet, devastating dignity, opened a thick leather briefcase at her feet. She handed Arthur a sealed, heavy document, adorned with blue ribbons and a gold notary seal. Arthur walked the document directly over to the judge's bench. "Your Honor, I'd like to formally submit Plaintiff's Exhibit F into evidence. This is the original unredacted patent application and the foundational incorporation charter for Ether Logistics filed securely in Delaware in 2014. Richard scoffed, trying to regain his footing. "So what? My signature is on the bottom of that." "I filed it. Your signature is indeed on page 12, as the designated administrative CEO." Arthur agreed. "But let's direct the court's strict attention to page 3, the intellectual property assignment, and page 7, the official capitalization table." Arthur turned to face Richard, his eyes sharp as flint. "Mr. Higgins, who is officially listed as the primary author of the algorithmic code that actually powers Ether Logistics." Richard's mouth went completely dry. He stared at Arthur, his brain short-circuiting, as the reality of the question set in. It was a joint filing." "It was not a joint filing, Mr. Higgins." Arthur's voice boomed completely, shedding its mild-mannered disguise. "The verified author of the code, the sole owner of the patent, and the majority 70% shareholder of the holding company that owns Ether Logistics, is and always has been Clara Higgins." The silence in courtroom 4B was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. Richard stared at his wife, the blood completely draining from his face until he looked like a ghost. Clara looked back at him, her eyes calm, incredibly intelligent, and completely unyielding. The grand illusion of his superiority was shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Diane Croft stood completely frozen at the defense table. Her meticulously crafted strategy had just disintegrated before her eyes. She turned slowly to her client, her sharp features twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Richard was staring at the Delaware Incorporation documents, as if they were written in an alien language. He had never bothered to read the legal paperwork when they founded the company. He had simply signed where his attorneys and his wife had pointed, too busy practicing his visionary CEO pitches in the mirror to care about the boilerplate details. "Richard," Diane hissed, her voice trembling with a terrifying professional rage. "Did you perjure yourself on my watch? Did you lie to me about the intellectual property? I didn't know." Richard stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the courtroom. "She just typed on a laptop. I raised the capital. I built the brand. She's a nobody." Judge Harrison Caldwell leaned over his elevated bench, staring down at Richard with the cold, predatory gaze of a hawk spotting a field mouse. "Mr. Higgins, I strongly suggest you stop speaking immediately before you incriminate yourself further. Ms. Croft, do you need a moment with your client?" "Your Honor, the defense requests a brief recess," Diane said tightly, desperate to perform damage control. "Denied," Judge Caldwell snapped. "Mr. Pendleton, you may proceed with your witness." Arthur Pendleton nodded gracefully and turned to Clara. "Your Honor, I call Clara Higgins to the stand." Clara stood up. She did not rush. She smoothed the front of her grey cardigan and walked toward the witness box with a steady, grounded cadence. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and took her seat. She looked completely out of place in the high-stakes corporate divorce arena, a soft, quiet woman in sensible flats, yet she commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. Arthur approached the podium, offering his client a warm, reassuring smile. "Mrs. Higgins, for the record, could you please explain your educational and professional background before the founding of Ether Logistics?" Clara adjusted the microphone. When she spoke, her voice was calm, clear, and devoid of any vindictiveness. It was the voice of a woman who had survived a long, dark storm and finally reached the shore. "I graduated summa cum laude from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 2006 with a dual degree in computer science and applied mathematics," Clara stated calmly. "Following graduation, I spent 6 years working as a senior data architect for a prominent global logistics firm in Seattle, specializing in predictive supply chain algorithms," the gallery murmured. Richard sank lower in his heavy leather chair, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the armrests. He had spent years telling their country club friends that Clara was just a former admin assistant who couldn't handle the corporate grind. "And why did you leave that lucrative position, Mrs. Higgins?" Arthur prompted gently. "I developed a severe autoimmune condition that attacked my thyroid." Clara explained, her eyes briefly meeting Richard's. "The chronic fatigue and the physical symptoms became unmanageable in a traditional office environment. Around the same time I married Richard. He was struggling in a mid-level medical sales job, incredibly unhappy and desperate to be an entrepreneur. I wanted to support his dreams, and my health required me to work from home. So I took a step back from the corporate world, but I never stopped coding." Arthur retrieved another document from his manila folder. "Let's discuss the algorithm that powers the $80 million valuation of Ether Logistics. Mr. Higgins testified that he coded it himself until his fingers bled. Is that accurate?" A small, sad smile touched Clara's lips. "Richard does not know the difference between Java and Python. He has never written a single line of functional code in his entire life. During the first 2 years of our marriage, while he was out networking, which mostly involved playing golf and racking up credit card debt, I sat at our kitchen table. I used my background in applied mathematics to build a proprietary predictive routing system. I wrote every single line of the back-end architecture. When it was finished, I realized it had massive commercial potential. If you wrote it, why was Mr. Higgins installed as the CEO? Arthur asked. Because I knew my husband's ego. Clara said, her voice carrying a profound, weary wisdom. Richard needed to be the star. He possessed a very specific charisma, a talent for aggressive salesmanship that I lacked, especially as my health declined and my weight fluctuated. I knew that the tech world was fiercely superficial. I proposed a partnership. I would handle the technical infrastructure quietly from the shadows, and he would be the bold, visionary face of the company. I gave him the spotlight because I loved him, and I wanted us to succeed as a team. But you protected yourself, Arthur noted, gesturing to the Delaware Charter sitting on the judge's bench. I am a data architect, Mr. Pendleton. I build secure systems, Clara replied smoothly. Before I handed Richard the keys to the kingdom, I legally registered the intellectual property under a holding company, Ethera Technologies, of which I am the sole manager and 70% majority shareholder. Richard was granted a 30% minority stake and the title of CEO in exchange for his sweat equity in sales and fundraising. He signed the operating agreement. I assumed he had read it. Judge Caldwell turned his piercing gaze toward the defense table. Ms. Croft, did your client fail to disclose to you that he is merely a minority shareholder in his own company? Diane Croft looked like she was chewing glass. It appears there was a severe breakdown in communication between myself and my client, Your Honor. A breakdown, Arthur Pendleton echoed, stepping closer to the jury box. Let's talk about breakdowns. Mrs. Higgins, as the company grew to an $80 million valuation, how did your husband treat his majority shareholder? Clara's calm exterior cracked just a fraction, revealing the raw, bleeding wounds of a decade of emotional abuse. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. He treated me like a repulsive burden. As the money poured in, he began to resent my presence. He moved me out of the master bedroom because he said my breathing bothered him. He mocked my weight constantly, often in front of our domestic staff. He told me that I was a grotesque, lazy parasite, feeding off his hard work. He isolated me, restricted my access to our primary bank accounts, and told me that if I ever tried to leave, he would ensure I ended up homeless because I was too stupid to survive without him. The courtroom was dead silent. The sheer cruelty of the dynamic, a man verbally destroying the brilliant woman who had secretly handed him his entire empire, hung heavy and suffocating in the air. And did you believe him? Arthur asked softly. For a long time, yes. Clara admitted, her voice thickening with emotion. Gaslighting is a slow poison. When someone you love tells you every single day that you are worthless, you eventually stop looking in the mirror. You forget who you used to be. But then 8 months ago, I found a receipt for a Cartier diamond necklace tucked inside the pocket of his golf bag. That broke the spell. Arthur nodded. What did you do after finding that receipt, Mrs. Higgins? I stopped crying, and I remembered that I am a systems engineer. Clara said, her posture straightening, her eyes flashing with a terrifying, brilliant light. I hacked into his private laptop. It took me less than 45 minutes to bypass his rudimentary passwords. I downloaded his emails, his private ledgers, and his communications with his accountant. I uncovered the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I found the deed to the Gold Coast penthouse. I found the fraudulent payroll records for Chloe Montgomery. I systematically compiled a terabyte of digital evidence detailing exactly how my CEO was defrauding his own company and his own wife. Richard leapt out of his chair, completely losing his mind. You bitch, you hacked my computer. That's illegal. Your Honor. She broke the law. Throw it all out. Judge Caldwell didn't even use his gavel. He simply pointed a rigid finger at Richard. "Bailiff, if Mr. Higgins speaks one more word out of turn, cuff him to the chair." The burly courtroom bailiff immediately stepped behind Richard, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. Richard collapsed back into his seat, panting heavily, looking like a cornered, terrified animal. The remaining 3 hours of the trial were an absolute bloodbath. Arthur Pendleton methodically introduced every single piece of evidence Clara had unearthed. He called the sleazy accountant Jerry to the stand, sweating profusely after being threatened with federal prosecution for wire fraud. Jerry flipped immediately. He detailed exactly how Richard had siphoned over $3 million in marital and corporate funds to finance his extravagant affair with Chloe Montgomery. Diane Croft essentially stopped defending her client. She sat rigidly at her table, asking no questions on cross-examination. She was already calculating how quickly she could file a motion to withdraw as his counsel the moment the heavy gavel finally fell. When both sides finally rested, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. The air was thick with heavy anticipation. Judge Caldwell spent 15 minutes quietly reviewing his copious notes, his face an impenetrable mask of severe judicial scrutiny. Finally, he stacked his papers, perfectly folded his hands, and looked directly at the defense table. "Mr. Higgins." Judge Caldwell began his voice, a low, rumbling thunder that promised absolute devastation. "In my 22 years on the bench, I have presided over thousands of divorces. I have seen staggering greed, I have seen infidelity, and I have seen cruelty. But rarely have I encountered a man so consumed by his own arrogance, so profoundly detached from reality, that he attempts to financially annihilate the very architect of his own success." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You sat in this courtroom and committed deliberate perjury. You stole community funds, committed corporate embezzlement to finance a mistress, and subjected your wife to a decade of vile, inexcusable psychological torment." Judge Caldwell picked up his pen. "Therefore, my ruling is as follows. The Delaware Incorporation documents stand as legally binding. Clara Higgins retains her 70% ownership of Ethera Technologies and its subsidiary. Mr. Higgins, your 30% minority stake will remain. However, you are hereby immediately stripped of your title as Chief Executive Officer, as the majority shareholder has formally requested your termination for gross financial misconduct and embezzlement." Richard gasped, his hands flying to his mouth. He had just been fired from his own company. "Regarding the marital estate," Judge Caldwell continued, "the Gold Coast penthouse purchased by Crescent Holdings was funded entirely by stolen marital assets. Therefore, I am awarding the property in its entirety to Mrs. Higgins. Mr. Higgins, your consultant, has exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises, or the Chicago Police Department will forcibly remove her." Clara remained perfectly still, but Arthur Pendleton offered her a small, satisfied nod. "Furthermore," the judge concluded, "Mr. Higgins is ordered to pay full restitution of the $2 million diverted to his mistress payable immediately from his remaining personal accounts. He will also be responsible for 100% of all legal fees. Finally, a complete transcript of this proceeding will be forwarded directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the District Attorney for review of potential criminal fraud charges." Judge Caldwell brought his heavy wooden gavel down with a deafening crack. "We are adjourned." Courtroom 4 erupted into a chaotic flurry of movement. Diane Croft did not even say goodbye to Richard. She simply snapped her briefcase shut, turned on her designer heel, and marched out. Richard sat frozen, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table. He had lost his company, his fortune, his mistress, and potentially his freedom. He slowly turned his head. Clara stood up, her movements graceful. She looked at Richard with absolutely freezing indifference. Did your jaw drop at that shocking courtroom twist? Clara perfectly destroyed the arrogant facade of her husband and claimed her rightful empire, leaving him with nothing but the crushing weight of his own terrible decisions. Justice was finally served cold. If you loved seeing this brilliant woman take back her power, you must hit that like button right now. Please share this incredible revenge story with your friends, and always remember to subscribe for more amazing video stories.